You don't choose your fantasies. They arrive uninvited. They appear in the stillness of night, in the cracks between boredom and desire, in the places where shame and longing collide. Sometimes they disturb you. Sometimes they thrill you. And sometimes they leave you wondering, what's wrong with me? But what if your strangest, most private sexual fantasy isn't a flaw in your character, but a key to your deeper self? Philosopher and psychoanalyst Carl Jung believed that our fantasies are not random. They're symbols, messages from the unconscious. Beneath every taboo, every bizarre or uncomfortable image lies something sacred, a truth that your conscious mind cannot or will not face directly. Freud, too, knew that sexuality wasn't just about pleasure. It was about power, memory, repression. He saw fantasies as disguised wishes, often rooted in unresolved childhood emotions, things we were told not to feel, not to want. And because they couldn't be expressed openly, they became distorted, eroticized, hidden in metaphor. Your weirdest fantasy, then, might not be about sex at all. It might be about freedom, about control, about safety, about rebellion. Let's say you fantasize about being dominated, told what to do, stripped of agency, powerless. On the surface, it seems dark, maybe even dangerous, but symbolically, it may be about surrender, about the desire to let go of constant control, about trusting someone enough to hold your vulnerability completely. Or perhaps your fantasy involves being watched, exposed, seen in your most intimate, unfiltered form. Is that perversion? Or is it the deep, human yearning to be fully known, not just sexually, but emotionally, spiritually? The fantasy becomes a theater, a stage where your shadow self, the part of you that's hidden, repressed, socially unacceptable, can speak. And the weirdness of it? That's just the mask it wears. Jung called it individuation, the process of becoming whole. And you can't be whole by cutting off parts of yourself, especially not the parts that cry out in fantasy, asking to be heard. But what happens when you judge that fantasy? When you bury it under guilt, or mock it, or dismiss it as meaningless? You miss the message. Imagine someone fantasizes about a teacher-student dynamic. The power imbalance may seem controversial, and rightly so in real life, but symbolically, it may point to something else entirely. A craving to be guided, mentored, shaped. A longing for structure, for knowledge, for surrender to wisdom. Or the MILF fantasy, often ridiculed, memified, or misunderstood. What's underneath? Maybe not lust for age, but a yearning for mature affection, for nurturing presence, for being wanted by someone confident and emotionally safe. The truth is, your fantasies are not your moral compass. They're your emotional mirror. They don't tell you what kind of person you are. They tell you what parts of you need attention, curiosity, care. And when you stop fearing them, when you stop moralizing or pathologizing them, you open the door to something liberating, understanding. This doesn't mean you need to act on your fantasies. Many of them are meant to remain in the realm of imagination, a safe space where forbidden emotions can play without consequence. But it does mean you can listen, ask, what is this fantasy asking of me? What part of me does it speak for? What wound, what hunger, what memory is it trying to soothe? In his work, philosopher Michel Foucault argued that society constructs repression, that many of our sexual taboos are not natural, but culturally imposed. And when we internalize those limits, the forbidden becomes seductive, not because it's dangerous, but because it's denied. So your weird fantasy might not be weird at all. It might be a rebellion against repression, a whisper from your psyche saying, "This is who I am beneath the mask." And to reject that whisper is to reject your own truth. Most people assume their sexual fantasies are either perverse anomalies or harmless entertainment. But the truth is far more intricate. Fantasies are stories your mind tells when you're not watching. They carry echoes of childhood, wounds from the past, internalized shame, unmet needs, power dynamics, and emotional gaps you've never fully confronted. And yet, we rarely pause to ask where they come from. The psychologist Donald Winnicott once said, "It is a joy to be hidden and a disaster not to be found." This paradox lives at the core of many fantasies. We want to be hidden, to escape judgment, to feel safe, but we also want to be found, seen, known, and desired in our most unguarded, even shameful form. So we create scenes in our imagination that allow both, secrecy and exposure, control and surrender, safety and risk. Fantasies are not arbitrary. They evolve as we evolve. A person who grew up in a household where emotions were suppressed may develop fantasies rooted in intensity, not because they crave chaos, but because their emotional world was never allowed to breathe. Others, raised in environments where love was conditional, may fantasize about total submission, not because they want to be controlled, but because they equate being wanted with being compliant. In this sense, fantasies become a language, a symbolic one, and like all languages, they require translation. A rape fantasy, one of the most commonly reported taboo fantasies, is often misunderstood. It's not about wanting to be violated. It's about relinquishing responsibility for desire, about being wanted so badly, so uncontrollably, that one doesn't need to ask. It's not a reflection of trauma or pathology in every case, but a symbolic shortcut to the intensity we often feel too ashamed to ask for directly. Similarly, someone who fantasizes about being humiliated or degraded might, in real life, be deeply confident, even powerful. The fantasy, then, is not a contradiction, but a counterbalance. It provides a release from the burden of control, the constant need to perform, succeed, or lead. In fantasy, we allow the parts of ourselves that aren't safe to express in daily life, our fragility, our rage, our helplessness, to surface. Carl Jung referred to this as engaging the shadow self, the part of us that contains everything we've repressed or denied. The fantasy is often the shadow's voice, but because we live in a culture obsessed with sanitizing desire, many of us never learn how to decode that voice. We judge it, we hide from it, and in doing so, we miss an opportunity to understand what our psyche is truly asking for. This doesn't mean all fantasies are psychologically healthy, or that everyone deserves to be acted out. In fact, many should remain internal, not because they're evil, but because their power lies in their symbolism, not their literal execution. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek once suggested that the point of fantasy isn't to get what we desire, it's to continue desiring, because the pursuit, the internal dance between what's forbidden and what's longed for, often tells us more about our inner life than the actual fulfillment ever could. Consider this. A person fantasizes about a partner being with someone else, a form of consensual, non-monogamy in imagination, but perhaps not in practice. Why? It could be about voyeurism, yes, but it could also be about jealousy, not in a destructive sense, but in the yearning to feel what it's like to desire that partner again, to see them through someone else's eyes. It's not about betrayal, it's about reigniting a sense of mystery, a reminder that desire isn't only born in possession, but in distance. Or take the reverse, fantasizing about being watched while with someone. There may be a hunger for validation, a longing to be seen as desirable, to feel chosen, not just by one partner, but by the world. In this way, fantasy becomes a form of emotional compensation, not because we are broken, but because we are searching for the missing piece that makes us feel alive, whole, seen, or safe. What this all points to is a simple but radical idea. Your weirdest fantasies are trying to tell you something, and instead of feeling ashamed, the wiser approach, the more philosophical approach, is to listen, not literally, but symbolically, not to act them out impulsively, but to decode them with compassion. Understanding your fantasies doesn't mean you're obliged to share them, but it does mean you're invited to become more conscious of what they reveal. And perhaps, as Jung suggested, when we bring the unconscious into the light, we stop being ruled by it in the dark. By now, we've come to understand that fantasies aren't just mental detours or guilty pleasures. They are messengers. They reveal who we are beneath the surface, who we've been, and sometimes who we want permission to become. But knowing that doesn't always make them easier to live with. The real question is, what do we do with this awareness? How do we live with desires that scare us, surprise us, or feel impossible to share? It starts with acceptance, not of the fantasy itself as something that must be acted out, but of its presence as something worthy of being explored. Many people carry intense shame around their fantasies, believing they are wrong, deviant, or broken for wanting what they want. But shame is the enemy of insight. It doesn't protect us from harm. It prevents us from understanding ourselves. Philosopher Michel Foucault once argued that the repression of sexuality doesn't make us more moral, it simply makes us more alienated from ourselves. So the first step is to look at the fantasy without judgment. What is it really saying? What is it compensating for? What need is it trying to meet? Not sexually, but emotionally? This is the therapeutic lens, not to indulge or suppress, but to listen. A fantasy about being dominated might not be about pain, but about trust. A fantasy about being used might not be about degradation, but about surrendering control, about being wanted so purely that you no longer have to perform or decide. But even with this insight, we live in a world of relationships, social contracts, and ethics. So the next question becomes, should you tell your partner? And if so, how? There's no universal answer. For some couples, sharing fantasies is liberating. It deepens trust, builds intimacy, and even revives desire. For others, it destabilizes what felt safe. The key is discernment. Don't reveal a fantasy just to shock, provoke, or test your partner's boundaries. Reveal it because you've come to understand what it symbolizes for you, and because you believe your partner deserves access to that truth, not to fulfill it, but to know you more fully. This is where vulnerability enters, and where philosophy meets the personal. As the Stoic Epictetus once said, if you wish to be loved, love. And love, in its truest form, involves risking exposure, not just of our virtues, but of our complexity, of our contradictions. We cannot ask to be deeply loved while hiding essential parts of ourselves behind walls of shame. Still, some fantasies are best kept private, not because they're wrong, but because their power lies in their privacy. You don't have to share everything to be whole, but you do need to confront it honestly with yourself. What you should never do is build a relationship or a self-image on the suppression of what's most real inside you. Repression doesn't make fantasies disappear. It makes them louder, more distorted, more likely to erupt in unhealthy ways. There's also the temptation to act out every fantasy, especially once you begin to explore them. But this, too, requires care. Just because something turns you on doesn't mean it's good for you. Desire alone isn't a justification. Philosophical maturity means learning to hold desire and responsibility in the same hand. As Aristotle once suggested, virtue isn't the absence of desire, it's the ability to govern it wisely. Some fantasies are meant to be felt, not fulfilled. Others, with the right partner and the right trust, can become a shared world, a playground of exploration that deepens intimacy. The difference lies in intention, consent, and clarity. Are you trying to escape your life or enrich it? Are you chasing a fantasy to avoid your emotions or to grow closer to yourself and your partner? At its best, the conscious engagement with fantasy is a path to wholeness. It allows you to reclaim parts of yourself you were taught to hide. It gives you the freedom to be curious about your inner world, not with fear, but with depth. And it reminds you that your sexuality is not a deviation from who you are, it's an expression of it. In the end, the goal isn't to purge yourself of weird desires or to mold them into something more palatable. It's to understand that what is most strange about you is often where your truest self lives, that the fantasies you fear may hold the key to the self you long to become. As Carl Jung wrote, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, even and especially in your most secret desires.